It was 9:47 p.m. when Edward Barnes heard something that stopped him cold on the staircase. Music. A delicate piano melody floated through the halls of his sterile, modern mansion, a sound he hadn't heard since his wife passed 3 years ago. He followed it silently, heart pounding faster with each step, until he reached the entrance to the grand room. There she was. Clara, his 8-year-old daughter, seated at the piano, and beside her, Helen Carter, the new live-in housekeeper, guiding her hands over the keys with careful, almost reverent movements. Her posture was graceful, her eyes focused, her presence magnetic. It was the first time in months Clara had smiled like that. Edward didn't make a sound, but something in him tightened, not out of anger but confusion. He had never permitted piano lessons, never even discussed it. And Helen, she was supposed to be organizing meals, not resurrecting ghosts. Yet here they were, connected by something he thought had died. He stepped back into the shadows. That night, he replayed the scene a dozen times. Something about the way Helen touched those keys, like she'd done it 1,000 times before. But who was she really? And why did she look so haunted? If thrilling stories full of secrets like this one keep you hooked from start to finish, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell. Every week we reveal real stories that few people know about and that you won't find anywhere else. Be a part of it. Don't miss out. Edward Barnes wasn't born into wealth. He built it. A self-made tech mogul, Edward earned his first million before the age of 30, and by 45, his name had become synonymous with success. He lived in a minimalist estate perched high above the Pacific, where every inch of glass and steel spoke of control, precision, and isolation. But behind the polished image was a man unraveling. 3 years ago, Edward lost his wife, Lillian, to a sudden aneurysm. She had been his anchor, soft where he was sharp, warm where he was cold. A gifted pianist, she filled their home with music, laughter, and life. After her death, Edward closed the piano, locked the music room, and buried everything that reminded him of her, including the part of himself that knew how to feel. Clara, their only child, was just 5 when it happened. A bright, imaginative little girl, she retreated into silence after her mother's passing. Edward, incapable of processing his own grief, had thrown himself into work, hiring a carousel of nannies and tutors to raise Clara, none of whom lasted long. Enter Helen Carter. She was unlike the others. Calm, focused, unshakably composed. A black woman in her early 30s, Helen carried herself with quiet dignity. Her resume was clean, her references impeccable, though oddly limited in detail. But Edward didn't ask questions. He needed someone stable for Clara, and Helen seemed to understand boundaries better than anyone before her. In just a few weeks, something shifted. Clara started drawing again, then talking, then laughing, rarely but genuinely. Helen had an effect on her, an invisible thread connecting them. Edward noticed, but remained distant. He paid her well, gave her space, and didn't interfere. Still, something about Helen intrigued him. She moved with elegance, like someone who had once lived a different life. Her posture was perfect, her speech precise, and she always wore a silver locket that Clara once tried to open, only for Helen to gently but firmly take it back without a word. Edward chalked it up to professionalism, or maybe pain. He didn't care to dig deeper, not until the night he heard the piano, that melody, Lillian's favorite, played not by a child plunking keys at random, but with technique, soul, and Helen, guiding Clara's hands as if she'd done it all her life. Edward's world operated on facts and figures, but something about Helen didn't add up, and for the first time in years, a question took root in his mind that he couldn't shake. Who exactly had he let into his home? Edward Barnes had rules: no music in the house, no talk of the past, and certainly no touching the piano in the West Wing. That glossy black Steinway had sat silent for years, dust collecting on its lid like snow on a grave. It was a shrine to grief, locked behind the weight of silence and a father's refusal to feel. But Clara remembered. She remembered her mother's gentle hands guiding hers on the keys, the lullabies played at bedtime, the way music used to live in every corner of their home. And she missed it. Terribly. For 3 long years, she lived in a world without song, tucked between rigid schedules, sterile tutors, and a father who loved her the only way he knew how, by providing. Then came Helen. She didn't ask questions. She didn't push, but she listened. And when Clara finally whispered, "I used to play," Helen simply nodded and replied, "Would you like to remember?" That was how it started. Not with a lesson, with a memory. Helen brought the piano back to life, one note at a time. At first, she played when Edward wasn't home, gentle, quiet scales, letting the sound reintroduce itself to the house. Clara watched, eyes wide. Then she asked to try. Her fingers were clumsy, but Helen was patient. She didn't correct harshly. She guided, encouraged, celebrated small victories. Clara began smiling more, drawing again, sleeping through the night. It wasn't just about music. It was about healing, for Helen too. Though she never said it aloud, every time she touched the keys, her expression shifted. There was history there. A longing, a ghost of someone who once lived for melody. Teaching Clara wasn't just helping the girl, it was awakening something buried deep inside herself. The sessions became a ritual. Afternoons by the piano, fingers stumbling, laughing, playing again. And in those quiet hours, Helen and Clara grew close, closer than Edward realized. Meanwhile, Edward remained detached. He noticed the change in Clara, yes, the way her shoulders relaxed, the sparkle returning to her eyes. But he didn't question it, didn't ask what had changed. He preferred not to know. Curiosity, in his world, often led to chaos. Until one night, Clara brought home a sheet of music. It had her mother's name written in the corner, Lillian Barnes. It was her favorite piece. Clara had found it in a box of old books in the attic and brought it to Helen, asking if they could try it. Helen froze when she saw the title, fingers brushing the notes like they were sacred, but she nodded. "Yes," she said softly, "we can try." That evening, they played together. The notes were shaky, imperfect, but full of heart, and Edward heard it. He didn't confront them immediately. Instead, he stood in the shadows, watching, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His daughter, alive in a way she hadn't been in years, and Helen, playing not like a housekeeper but like someone who had once owned a stage. Something stirred in him that night, not just suspicion, something deeper, a memory, a feeling. Still, he said nothing. The next day, Clara asked him directly, "Daddy, can I have real piano lessons?" The question caught him off guard. He didn't say no, but he didn't say yes either. He only said, "Not now," and left the room. Clara was disappointed. But Helen, she understood. The question meant the ice was thawing. Privately, Edward opened the drawer in his study. Inside was a photo of Lillian at the piano, taken the year before she died. In it, she looked radiant, alive, and Helen's hands, the way she moved, it was too familiar. That's when he noticed something else. The locket, the one Helen always wore. In the photo, Lillian had one just like it. The same chain, the same silver clasp. Coincidence or something else? Edward's world didn't allow for coincidence. He knew it was time to start digging. The next morning, Edward's routine changed. He skipped his usual conference call, shut his office door, and sat down at his desk, not to review quarterly reports, but to search. He typed slowly at first, almost hesitant. Helen Carter, California. Nothing out of the ordinary. A few housekeeping certifications, a clean background check, references that all trace back to a small agency he vaguely remembered contacting. But the details were thin, too neat. He tried again, adding music to the search, then piano, then performance. Still nothing, but something gnawed at him. The way she moved, her posture, Her expression when she played. He'd seen it before, not in person but in videos, back when he and Lillian used to attend concerts, before their world became one of silence and shadows. So he dug deeper. He found an old news article from nearly 10 years ago, buried behind broken links and archived web pages. The headline read, "Prodigious pianist disappears days before Carnegie debut." Her name? Helena Carter. Not Helen, but the photo was unmistakable. A decade younger, longer curls, a brighter smile, but it was her, a prodigy, vanished without explanation. Edward leaned back, stunned. Why would someone with a future like that abandon everything to clean houses? And what had happened to her? He printed the article and placed it on his desk. Then that afternoon, he returned home early, something he rarely did. Clara wasn't in the main rooms. He walked toward the west wing and stopped just short of the doorway. There they were again, Helen's hands on the keys, Clara beside her, following along. But something was different this time. Helen was playing a melody he hadn't heard in years. A piece Lillian had composed but never published. It had never left the walls of this house. How could Helen know it? His voice cut through the music like a blade. "Where did you learn that?" Helen's fingers froze. Clara jumped. Helen turned slowly, calm, composed. But Edward saw it, the flicker of fear in her eyes. Clara looked between them, confused. "She didn't mean anything, Daddy. I asked her to play it." Edward stepped forward. "That piece was private. Only Lillian knew it. Only she ever played it." Helen opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Clara stood. "I found the sheet in Mom's old folder. Helen just helped me." Edward paused. He took a breath, then turned to Helen. "We need to talk. Alone." Clara looked nervous but obeyed. Inside his office, Edward placed the article between them. "This you?" Helen glanced at it, then at him. "Yes, you were going to tell me when." "I wasn't." "Why?" She hesitated. "Because that life is gone." Edward didn't respond. He studied her face. Every twitch, every breath. She wasn't lying. But she wasn't telling the whole truth either. "And the song?" he asked. "I recognized it," she said softly. "From a video. Years ago. Your wife played it once at a charity event. It stayed with me." That answer didn't sit right. "Why lie about your name?" "I didn't lie. I shortened it. It was safer." "Safer from what?" Helen didn't answer. That silence was enough to light Edward's alarms. He ended the conversation with a single sentence. "I want you to stop the lessons. Immediately." Helen didn't flinch. "As you wish." But that night, Clara cried herself to sleep. And Edward couldn't stop thinking about the way Helen's hands hovered over the keys, like they belonged there, like they were home. He poured himself a drink and stared at the article again. There had to be more. A reason she disappeared, a reason she hid. So he called in a favor from an old contact in journalism, Mark Sullivan, a man who owed him more than one. "I need you to look into someone," Edward said, discreetly. Mark didn't ask why. He never did. 2 days later, the call came. "She's not just a pianist, Ed," Mark said. "She was married to Victor Lang. Remember him?" Edward blinked. "The maestro?" "Yeah. He died under odd circumstances. There was an investigation, quiet but messy, money laundering, ties to some very ugly people. And Helen? Disappeared the day after his funeral. No interviews, no performances. Just gone." Edward's blood ran cold. The prodigy, the widow, the mystery, and now the governess in his home, playing lullabies to his daughter. What was she running from? And worse, had she brought it with her? The confrontation came the next morning. Edward had barely slept. The revelations from Mark circled in his mind like a storm. Helena was not who she claimed to be, a vanished pianist, the widow of a disgraced conductor, connected to a scandal, a mystery that now sat in his kitchen, folding linens like none of it ever happened. He couldn't let it continue, not under his roof, not around Clara. When he entered the dining room, Clara and Helen were already seated, laughing quietly over breakfast. Clara held a folded paper, sheet music. Edward felt something crack inside. "Clara," he said, voice tight. "Can you give us a moment?" His daughter blinked at his tone. She glanced at Helen, who nodded gently. Then she stood slowly and left the room. Edward waited for the door to close. Then he placed the printed article on the table between them. "You lied." Helen looked at the page, didn't blink, didn't touch it. "I withheld," she said calmly. "There's a difference." "You deceived me," he snapped. "You changed your name, changed your life, moved into my house under false pretenses." "I was hired to care for Clara," she replied, her voice steady. "And I have." Edward paced, the rage rising beneath his tailored suit. "You taught her music, after I specifically said—" "She needed it," Helen interrupted. Her voice didn't rise, but it cut through the room like glass. "She needed someone to help her remember joy. And you weren't doing it." He stopped, turned. "What gives you the right to say that?" "I live here, I watch her, I see the sadness in her, the weight she carries for a child who barely speaks at school, who flinches when you walk into the room. She needed something. Music gave her back a piece of her mother." Edward's hands clenched into fists. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know grief," she said quietly. "I know what silence does to a home." He stepped closer. "Don't you dare compare our situations." "I'm not," Helen said. "I'm telling you." "I understand," but he wasn't listening. Not really. His pride was louder than her words. "You're fired," he said, his voice like stone. "Pack your things. I want you out by tonight." For the first time, Helen faltered. Her eyes dropped, not from guilt, but from heartbreak. "What about Clara? She'll adjust." Helen took a breath. "You're making a mistake." He didn't answer, just turned and left the room. But the mistake wasn't hers. Word spread quickly in the house. The driver avoided eye contact. The cleaning staff whispered. Clara refused to speak at all. When she realized Helen was leaving, she ran upstairs and locked herself in her room. Helen didn't fight it. She packed quietly, folded everything neatly, and placed a small letter on the kitchen table. She didn't say goodbye. By nightfall, she was gone. Edward felt the silence return instantly. Louder now. The halls that once echoed with hesitant melodies were empty again. The piano sat untouched, but his peace didn't last. 3 days later, an envelope arrived. No return address. Inside, a flash drive and a note. She told the truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. Edward inserted the drive into his laptop with trembling fingers. The screen lit up with a video. It was security footage. Grainy, a hallway, dimly lit. A man, tall and elegant in a tuxedo, Victor Lang, arguing with someone off camera. A female voice, desperate, pleading. Then a slap, loud, jarring. Seconds later, Victor staggered backward. His foot caught the edge of a stair. He fell, head first, down a marble flight. No scream, no cut to black, just silence. Then the woman appeared on screen. Helen. Frozen, staring, hands over her mouth. Edward leaned back, stunned. It wasn't murder, it wasn't planned, it was an accident, or was it? His phone buzzed. Another message. Unknown number. "Do you still think you know who she is?" He stared at the screen, heart pounding. The walls around him suddenly felt thinner, colder. The perfect order of his world had cracked, and through it a flood of questions surged. Who had sent the video? Why now? And most importantly, why did Clara's new favorite lullaby sound so much like a requiem? The house felt different after Helen left, colder somehow, quieter. The warmth that had been creeping back into the corners of Edward's home vanished overnight. Not that he'd ever admit it aloud, not that he could, but Clara noticed, and she didn't hide it. She stopped talking again, stopped drawing, stopped eating dinners at the table, and began spending long hours alone in her room, staring at the piano bench, like it might bring Helen back if she waited long enough. Edward watched this unfold with increasing discomfort. He tried once to make scrambled eggs the way Clara liked, burned them, tried to play a few notes on the piano, out of tune, stiff, meaningless. He gave up both times. She didn't want substitutes. She wanted Helen. And so Clara mourned her. At school, teachers called. "She seems distant," they said, "withdrawn." Edward offered polite assurances. "We're just going through some changes at home." But privately, he started to worry, not just for Clara, but about himself. He kept replaying that security footage. Victor Lang falling, Helen frozen, her hands trembling. She hadn't pushed him, but she hadn't saved him either. And then there was that second voice on the recording, the one arguing with Victor, the one that wasn't Helen's. That voice haunted him. It wasn't until a week later that he heard it again, on the answering machine. The message was brief, scrambled, distorted. "She's not who you think," the voice said, "and you're next." He played it 5 times, then deleted it, not out of fear, but out of denial. The whole situation was spiraling, his carefully ordered life now full of shadows and secrets. He had no control, and he hated it. Meanwhile, Clara got worse. One night he found her sitting on the staircase at 2 in the morning, clutching Helen's locket. How she got it, he didn't know. "Why did you make her leave?" she asked. Edward hesitated. "Because she wasn't honest." Clara shook her head. "She was the only person who told me stories about Mom, the only one who remembered her the way I do." He sat beside her, unsure what to say. "She used to hum Mom's lullaby," Clara continued. "She said your heart could remember songs, even after your ears forget them. Do you believe that?" Edward stared ahead. "I don't know." That answer broke something in her. Clara stood and went back upstairs, leaving him there in silence. Later that week, another package arrived, a single photograph, black and white, old. Helen, younger, at a piano recital. In the background, barely visible, was Lillian Barnes, smiling. On the back of the photo, a date, 2007, and a handwritten note. "She didn't just know your wife, she loved her." Edward gripped the photo, his throat tightening. He didn't know what it meant. He wasn't sure he wanted to. But then came the final blow. Mark Sullivan called again, this time with urgency. "Ed, you need to know something. That footage of Victor's fall. It was never made public, not even in court. Only 3 people had access to it." Edward's chest tightened. "Then how did I get it? That's what I'm trying to find out. But listen. Someone doesn't want this story uncovered, and if Helen's in danger, so is anyone near her." He hung up and sat in the dark. The story he thought he was unraveling, about a mysterious pianist with a secret, was bigger than her, than Victor, than any of them, and Clara was caught in the middle. That night, Edward had a dream. He stood in the music room, the piano playing itself, keys moving with invisible hands. Lillian appeared beside him, looking peaceful, but when he reached for her, she turned into Helen, and then Clara, and then silence. When he woke, his hands were trembling. By morning he made a decision. He called every agency he knew, trying to track Helen down. Nothing. He tried the number she'd left on her application, disconnected. It was like she'd vanished again. But Clara hadn't. She remained, small, quiet, watching him with eyes full of unspoken questions. He couldn't bear the weight of them. So for the first time in years, he sat at the piano. Clara came in, surprised, watched from the doorway. "I don't know how to play," he admitted. She stepped forward. "I can teach you what she taught me." They sat together, and slowly, note by note, the silence began to break. If at any time this story has touched something inside you, leave a like and share in the comments what has touched you the most so far. Sometimes what moves us can also inspire others. Your voice is part of this conversation, and it can make all the difference. The break came not through Edward, but through Clara. It was a Thursday afternoon when she walked into his office, holding something tightly in her hand. Her eyes were red. She'd been crying, but her voice was steady. "I found this under the piano bench." It was a folded envelope, old and yellowed, addressed to L.B. in cursive script. Lillian Barnes. Edward took it carefully. Inside, a letter, handwritten. The ink faded but legible. "Dearest Lillian, thank you for the light you gave me when mine was fading, for the music, the home, the friendship. You believed in me when I had nothing left to believe in, and if one day you're reading this again, I hope it means I found my way back. I hope I'm brave enough." Edward read the letter twice. He never knew they had met, let alone grown close. Lillian had never mentioned a prodigy named Helena, but the words were intimate, personal. There was love in them, not romantic perhaps, but something deep. Shared pain, shared dreams. He searched the drawer in his desk again and pulled out the photo. Now it made sense. Helena hadn't come into their lives by accident. She had come home. Mark called again that evening, his tone sharper. "I found something you're not going to like." Edward braced himself. "There's a sealed police report from the night Victor Lang died. It was suppressed, paid for, but I have contacts." One of the responding officers wrote a private memo. Apparently before the fall, Lang was involved in a major scheme, art laundering through musical foundations, international scale, and Lillian Barnes. Her name shows up. Edward stood still. "That's impossible." "I thought so too, but it turns out Lillian and Victor performed together at several charity concerts. She might have been unknowingly caught in it, or maybe she knew. We can't tell from the file. What we do know is," he hesitated, "someone warned her to back out a week before she died." Edward's breath left him. Lillian's death had been ruled an aneurysm, sudden, tragic, no autopsy, no signs of foul play. But now, the timeline, the performances, the warning. Helen knew more, maybe much more, and she'd come back into Edward's life, into Clara's, not just to help, maybe to protect. That night, Edward didn't sleep. Instead, he pored over every photograph, every concert program, every forgotten note of Lillian's past. And slowly, a new picture began to form. Victor Lang had been the face of a scheme. Lillian Barnes, a potential witness. Helena Carter, the collateral damage. And Clara, the last link to a truth someone had tried to bury. He knew what he had to do. He called Mark. "I need to find her, no more games," Mark agreed. "I'll dig deeper. But Ed, be careful. If this is what it looks like, someone didn't want her found the first time." Edward hung up and walked into the living room, where Clara sat with the locket. She looked up at him. "Are you mad?" He knelt beside her. "No, I think I've been wrong about a lot of things." She held out the locket, and for the first time, Edward opened it. Inside were two tiny photos, one of Lillian and one of Helen, side by side, together. Not just friends, sisters in sound, sisters in survival, and maybe allies in something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. The search began that weekend. Edward contacted Mark again, this time with more urgency. "I don't care what it costs. I need to know where she is, and I need to know who's watching her." Mark didn't ask questions. He never did. Within 48 hours, he called back. "She's in Oakland," he said, "working under a different name, low profile, teaching piano to underprivileged kids at a community center, living in a studio apartment, no phone listed, no social media, nothing." Edward didn't wait. He drove up the coast alone, leaving Clara with his sister. His hands gripped the wheel like they were holding back time. He hadn't told Clara he was going. He didn't know what he would say. He only knew this wasn't about control anymore. It was about making things right. When he arrived at the community center, it was late afternoon. The building was small, old, but well kept. Through the open window, he heard faint music, scales, laughter, clapping, and then her voice. Warm, encouraging, real. He stepped inside. She was seated at a worn-out upright piano surrounded by 5 children. Her posture was still perfect, her presence gentle, magnetic. She hadn't seen him yet. He waited. When the lesson ended and the children ran off, Helen looked up. Their eyes met. For a long moment neither spoke. Then she stood. "You found me," she said softly. "I did. You shouldn't have. I had to." Helen's expression didn't change, but her shoulders dropped just slightly, as if she'd been holding her breath for years. Edward stepped closer. I know about Victor, about the foundation, about the video. She looked away. I didn't push him, she said. I know. I didn't save him either. He nodded. I know that too. Silence stretched between them. I also know about the warning sent to Lillian, he continued. The concerts, the laundering, everything you've tried to hide. Helen closed her eyes. I tried to protect her. She never told me about any of it. She wanted to keep you safe. And Clara, she was scared, but she didn't want to live in fear. Edward felt something twist in his chest. She died believing she had escaped it all, Helen said. But I didn't. After Victor fell, I was told to disappear, leave everything, or they'd come for me next. Who told you that? She hesitated. A man named Reynolds. He worked with Victor. He said I had one chance to vanish. So I did. Edward clenched his jaw. And now, I stayed quiet, she said. Until Clara? You came back for her? No, she whispered. I came back for myself. I was tired of hiding, but when I saw her, when I saw how lost she was, how much she reminded me of her mother, I couldn't just do nothing. Edward sat down across from her. She misses you. Helen nodded. I miss her too. A beat. Then he spoke the hardest words. I was wrong. Helen looked at him, waiting. I judged you. Without asking, without understanding. I thought keeping things quiet was keeping us safe, but silence didn't protect Lillian, and it nearly cost Clara too. Helen's eyes softened. I want to fix it, he said. I want the truth out. I want Reynolds found. I want your name cleared. Helen laughed once, tired, cautious. You can't undo the past. No, he agreed. But maybe we can stop it from repeating. She looked down at her hands, at the locket she still wore. What if it's not over? Then we finish it. For the first time, Helen smiled. Faint, but real. Edward stood. I want you to come back. Helen raised an eyebrow. To the house? No, he said. To Clara. She hesitated. I hurt her when I left. You also saved her when you stayed. Another long pause. Then she nodded. I'll come. As they walked out of the center, Edward's phone buzzed. A message. Blocked number. You found her. Let's see what you do next. He showed it to Helen. She read it. Face unreadable. Looks like we're not done yet, she said. Edward slid the phone into his pocket. No, he replied. Now we begin. Edward Barnes had never stepped foot into a police precinct as anything but a donor. His name sat on a plaque in the lobby of the downtown San Francisco station. Benefactor of community safety. That day, he passed it without even a glance. He wasn't there as a benefactor. He was there to expose a secret that had been buried for nearly a decade. Helen walked beside him, her hands trembling despite the calm mask on her face. She wore no makeup, no jewelry but the silver locket, and carried a single folder, documents, photographs, and a copy of the footage. Proof. They were led into a small office by a young detective named Carter, who looked too fresh-faced to believe half of what Edward was about to say. But Carter listened, took notes, asked precise questions, and when Edward handed him the flash drive, the room fell silent. Carter watched the video twice, said nothing. When it ended, he leaned back. Where did you get this? It was sent to me anonymously, Edward said. Twice. And you believe this Reynolds orchestrated a cover-up? Yes, Helen said. Her voice was steady now. Victor Lang was laundering millions through international performances. He used my name, my talent, to give it legitimacy. When I found out, I threatened to go to the press. That night, we fought. He hit me. He fell. I didn't push him, but I didn't stop it either. Carter exhaled slowly. And after that, I was told to disappear by Reynolds. He said if I ever resurfaced, they'd make it look like I killed Victor on purpose. That I'd be buried before I ever saw a courtroom. The detective nodded. And you believe they're still watching you? I don't believe it, Edward said. I know it. They've been sending me messages since I started asking questions. Carter paused. I'll escalate this, he said. But we'll need more than this to bring Reynolds in. Edward expected that, so he handed over the trump card, a check, drawn from a foundation set up in Victor Lang's name. The signature on it? Reynolds. Carter raised his eyebrows. Where did you get this? Buried in the archives of a now-defunct arts non-profit, a shell corporation. One of many. Carter stared at the check, then looked at Edward. I'll start the paperwork. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it was movement. For the first time in years, the story was no longer locked in silence. As they left the station, Helen looked over at Edward. You really did your homework. He gave her a wry smile. I've been running from this for too long. That afternoon they drove back to the estate. Clara was waiting. She stood at the front steps as they pulled up, her arms crossed in that stubborn way that reminded Edward so much of her mother. When Helen stepped out of the car, Clara didn't move at first. Then slowly she ran forward. Helen bent to meet her. No words, just an embrace. Edward watched, standing back, unsure of his place in the moment. But when Clara turned and looked at him, really looked, he saw something he hadn't seen in years: trust. That evening they all sat in the music room. The piano was polished again. The room, alive. Clara played the first few notes of her mother's lullaby. Stumbled. Helen guided her hand. They laughed. They tried again. Edward didn't join in, but he listened, and it filled something in him he hadn't realized was empty. Later that night, while Clara was asleep, Helen came to the office. There's something I didn't tell the detective. Edward looked up. I never stopped watching Reynolds. Even after I ran, I tracked his foundations, the charities, the festivals. He's still moving money, and I think he's coming here. Edward's stomach turned. Why? Because I came back. And because you're making noise. That message you got wasn't just a scare tactic, it was a warning. Edward stood. We should go to the press. Helen shook her head. Not yet. We need undeniable proof. He paused. Then we bait him. Helen raised an eyebrow. Announce a foundation, Edward continued. A music initiative under Clara's name. Public, splashy, high profile. He won't be able to resist if he thinks he can use it. Helen stared at him. You'd do that? I already lost one woman I love to silence, Edward said. I won't lose another. They put the plan in motion the next morning. A press release, a website, an elegant gala scheduled for 2 weeks later. Clara Barnes Foundation for Musical Healing. It went viral. Within days, donations poured in, emails from old colleagues, invitations to speak, and one letter, unsigned, arrived by courier. It read, Glad to see the Barnes name back in the spotlight. We should talk. I hear your daughter plays beautifully. Helen read it, then folded it carefully. He's coming. Edward nodded. And this time, he said, we'll be ready. The gala was held in the Barnes estate, under crystal chandeliers and soft golden lighting. Every corner of the house had been transformed. Velvet drapes, a catered dinner, a string quartet warming up in the far end of the music room. Guests arrived dressed in black tie, whispering the name Barnes like it had just come back into fashion. But beneath the polished veneer, there was tension. Edward stood at the entry, welcoming donors and media alike with a calculated charm. Helen moved through the room with calm poise, her presence both elegant and quiet, like a shadow of someone they once knew but couldn't quite place. Clara, dressed in a simple navy gown, stood beside the piano. She had memorized her piece, practiced every night, and tonight she would play in front of strangers who had no idea they were stepping into a trap. Because tonight wasn't just about music, it was about truth. Somewhere among the clinking glasses and champagne smiles, Reynolds would come. They were sure of it. And he did. Edward spotted him halfway through the evening, slipping in unnoticed, wearing a dark suit and a too confident smile. He blended in perfectly with the sea of donors, the kind of man used to moving money behind closed doors. Edward nodded at Mark Sullivan, stationed discreetly by the bar, armed with a recording device. The plan was simple. Engage Reynolds, let him talk, push just enough to get him to admit something, anything. The authorities were waiting in a van down the hill, tuned into Mark's live feed. But Reynolds was careful. Too careful. He chatted with donors, dropped phrases like public impact and art diplomacy, and avoided Edward and Helen entirely for the first hour. Then, as Clara stepped on stage and sat at the piano bench, the room quieted. She began to play. The notes were soft, trembling at first, then stronger, a blend of her mother's lullaby and her own variations. Her fingers moved with confidence now, shaped by months of quiet resilience. Reynolds stopped to listen, watched her, and smiled. Edward saw it. That subtle nod of satisfaction, as if claiming ownership of something beautiful. That was the moment. He walked over. "Enjoying the performance?" Edward asked. Reynolds turned. "She's talented. Must take after her mother." Edward didn't flinch. "Funny you say that. You knew Lillian, didn't you?" Reynolds' expression didn't change. "We crossed paths. She was inspiring, just like Victor Lang." That name did it. A pause, a flicker. Edward leaned closer. "You ever miss him?" Reynolds looked him straight in the eye. Victor had many talents, some more useful than others. Mark edged closer, listening in. Edward pushed further. "Must be hard keeping all those foundations clean. So many people involved." Reynolds smiled again. "Edward, if you knew how the world really worked, you'd sleep with one eye open." And then Helen approached. She hadn't planned to, but something in her chest told her it was time. "You haven't changed," she said. Reynolds turned slowly. "Ah, Helena. Or is it Helen now? Lovely surprise. You watched me suffer," she said, her voice low. "You made me vanish." Reynolds chuckled. "I didn't make you do anything. You ran." "No," she said, "I survived." Reynolds leaned in, his voice dropping. "You should have stayed hidden." Mark caught it all. That was enough. Within minutes, officers entered the estate quietly. They didn't make a scene. No need. Reynolds was arrested on conspiracy, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and intimidation of a witness. As the guests murmured and scattered, Edward stood still, watching the man disappear into handcuffs. It was over. But not really. The next morning, the headlines exploded. "Elite donor arrested at Barnes Gala for international fraud ring. Mysterious pianist, tied to decade-old scandal, emerges in public again. The woman who refused to disappear." The media wanted interviews. Helen declined. Clara went back to school the following week, her classmates buzzing about the story, but she didn't care. She only cared that her father sat beside her at breakfast, that Helen was back in the house, that music played in the halls again. Edward, for his part, finally understood something that had eluded him for years. Control wasn't protection, silence wasn't safety, and love, real love, required risk. He reopened the room Lillian had used for her music therapy sessions, turned it into a learning space again, invited children from the community to join. Helen taught, Clara helped, Edward funded it all. People came, then more. The Barnes name no longer meant technology or money, it meant healing. Justice moved slowly, as it always does. Reynolds denied everything in court, but the recordings, the documents, and the testimonies were enough. He was convicted on multiple counts. Helen's name was cleared. The article about her disappearance was updated, not vanished, but resurfaced. And not with shame, but with dignity. One night, after a long day of lessons, Edward found Helen on the patio, looking up at the stars. "Do you regret coming back?" he asked. She didn't look at him. "I regret staying away for so long." He nodded, sat beside her. "We still have a lot of work to do," he said. She smiled. "Then let's start with tomorrow." Inside, Clara played softly. This time, the music didn't echo alone. It filled the house. It filled them. And it stayed. What makes someone disappear? Is it the act of vanishing itself, or the world's willingness to stop looking? Helen Carter didn't vanish because she was weak. She vanished because survival demanded it. Because a system built to protect the powerful told her that silence was her only way out. And for years, she believed it. She swallowed her past, buried her gift, and became invisible, not just to the world, but to herself. Edward Barnes, for all his wealth and intelligence, had done something similar. He didn't run, but he hid, behind work, behind logic, behind a fortress of control that kept emotion at bay. Losing Lillian broke something in him, and instead of facing the pieces, he hardened. He became unshakable, untouchable, and in the process, unreachable. But Clara, she was the bridge neither of them expected. A child, untouched by legacy or guilt, who simply wanted to remember the sound of her mother's music. Her need was pure, honest, and through that honesty she forced open doors both Edward and Helen had long sealed shut. This wasn't just a story about crime or justice, it was about connection, about how the smallest acts, a shared song, a forgotten melody, a hand guiding another across piano keys, can reopen wounds and heal them in the same breath. It was about how trauma doesn't disappear with time. It waits. It lingers in the shadows of our decisions, until we either face it or let it rot everything we build on top of it. Helen's return forced Edward to face truths he'd spent years avoiding. That control doesn't equal love. That protection doesn't always mean silence. And that grief, if locked away too long, doesn't fade. It festers. But perhaps the biggest lesson came not in the courtroom or the headlines, but in the stillness of a room filled with music. Because when Clara played, surrounded by the people who had once failed to protect her joy, something remarkable happened. The silence gave way, not just in the house, but in their hearts. Edward let go of fear, Helen let go of shame, and Clara, she simply grew, not defined by secrets or danger or loss, but by song, by love, by choice. In the end, maybe that's the real victory, not justice in the eyes of the law, but healing, between a father and daughter, between past and future, between silence and sound. 6 months after the gala, the Barnes estate looked different, not just in appearance but in energy. The music room was now a community sanctuary. 3 days a week, children from local schools came to learn, practice, and perform. Helen ran the program with quiet authority, blending technique with empathy. No auditions, no fees, just passion and patience. Edward funded everything, not as a gesture of charity, but of transformation. He no longer viewed wealth as a shield, but as a tool. One that could fix more than broken systems, one that could rebuild trust, especially with the daughter he was still learning to understand. Clara thrived. She had begun composing her own music, short pieces that blended classical structure with bursts of unfiltered emotion. She played them for Helen, and sometimes for Edward too. And while he still struggled to follow the notes, he understood the feeling. He felt it every time she smiled after finishing a piece. The media eventually moved on. Other scandals, newer headlines. Reynolds, despite his lawyer's best efforts, remained in custody. Several more arrests followed, and the network he once operated was officially dismantled. But none of that made the news in Clara's world. What mattered to her wasn't the courtroom, but the classroom, the lessons, the people. Helen never returned to the stage, at least not as a performer. She said the spotlight no longer called to her, but the joy of watching others discover music, that never faded. She became something more than a teacher. She became a guide. Edward often found her in the early mornings, seated at the piano alone, fingers drifting across the keys like they were searching. Not for fame, but for peace. And every time, the melody ended with a quiet smile, as if she'd found it. As for Edward, he still made mistakes, still worked too much, still had moments when silence felt safer than sincerity. But now, he caught himself. Now, he chose differently. He took Clara to her recitals. He joined her in practice, sometimes just listening, sometimes tapping out a rhythm on the wood like a metronome with no tempo but his own. And most importantly, he let go, not of memory, but of fear. He no longer saw the piano as a monument to loss, but as a bridge to something alive. One evening, Clara asked him, "Do you think Mum would be proud?" Edward didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "She'd be proud of all of us." They sat together, listening as Helen played in the background. No audience, no pressure, just the three of them. Not perfect, but together. And that was enough. "And now, we want to hear from you. After everything you've just seen, what would you have done in Edward's place? Would you have trusted Helen? Would you have dug deeper into her past? Or let sleeping secrets lie? Stories like this aren't just about mystery or scandal. They're about the choices we make when faced with uncomfortable truths, about the walls we build to protect ourselves, and the courage it takes to tear them down. Edward thought silence was safety. Helen believed invisibility was survival. And Clara, she reminded them both that healing starts the moment we decide to listen. So now we invite you to reflect. Do you think justice was truly served? Was Reynolds' arrest enough? Or do you believe there are still pieces of this story hidden beneath the surface? Let us know in the comments. Your opinion matters more than you think. Every perspective adds a new note to this story, and we read every single one. And if this story moved you even half as much as it moved us while writing and producing it, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notifications. We post stories like this every week, real, emotional, unforgettable. Finally, share this video with someone who believes that music can heal, and that even the quietest voices deserve to be heard. Because sometimes the most powerful stories begin in silence.